I'm in chilly Niagara Falls right now. It's been a cold one, that's for sure. So it's Jim Norris. I'm the publisher of Entertainment Spotlight and the president of Entertainment Marketer. Been in the business for about 45 years, so been around a while. As far as this webinar, why we're doing that, we do one every month pretty well, but it seemed a good time with the year just starting, try and get some sense of where things are going. It's a pretty crazy world right now, I think you'd agree. And for your own planning, your career, whether you're a musician or in the industry, this is a good time to be get the most out of 2025, and that's certainly a challenge. John Harris from Harris Institute will be joining us shortly, and I'll give him a brief introduction, which is going to be a challenge because he's done a lot of stuff. So we're going to do a poll in a minute just to find out who all of you are. The chat is there, so you can chat with anybody. Questions, there's a little Q&A question mark right in the bottom, so you can put your questions in anytime, and then we're going to just save them for the end. But anytime you think of anything at all, just put it right in there. This will all be recorded, and afterwards you will get an email telling you where the recording is. It'll be on YouTube in our YouTube site. One important point, I've attended probably hundreds of seminars and webinars over the years and presented a lot of them as well. Gone to hundreds of trade shows. So the one thing that's important is the follow-up that you're going to do, and that's a challenge. But people go to something like this on a Thursday, they take in all kinds of information, and then get up the next day and just don't do anything different. So I think the important thing is if you can write down, or whichever way you want to do it digitally, write it on your forehead, whatever you want to do with it, but 4 or 5 things that you're going to do differently starting tomorrow. I think that's important with anything you go to. If you go to what was Canadian Music Week, or you go to any of the different events that are going on, or indie events, I think that's important afterwards, is just to come up with a follow-up plan so that whatever it is you learned is not just a bunch of information that goes into your brain. Okay, so now we're going to find out a little bit about you guys. Alrighty, so first thing we want to know is where you're from. And I made it real simple. I just made it Canada, United States, and foreign. Not that we want to call you foreigners by any means, but okay. Well, it's pretty predictable. I'll publish that. So 86% Canadian, 9% US, and 4% outside of those 2 countries. Okay. So the other thing we want to know is what it is you do, and you'll see there's a list here that I made up. Probably a lot of you are musicians. With this one too, it's multiple choice. So obviously a lot of people that are in the music business do more than one thing. Sometimes that's just because you're multi-talented, but sometimes it's just that you need to eat. So you can see there's over half are musicians. A lot of those are songwriters, of course, music industry personnel. Let me publish that. You can have a look at it. Not too surprising, really. Mostly musicians and industry folks. Some pro audio, some educators, some media. Excellent. Okay, that's great. So John Harris, This is a tough one. I've just figured it out. I just counted the years on my fingers. Figured out that I've known John for 55 years. And some of you people say, "Oh my God." It also turns out that our birthdays are one day apart, but John's one day older than me. So I first met John when I was a musician back in the old days, and he was managing, don't remember which band that was at the time, but that's how I first met him, is that we played with a lot of the bands that John used to manage back in around 1970 or so, is my memory of it. Yeah, that's a few years ago, say the least. So I knew him through those days, and then I kind of left the industry for a while, came back, started Canadian Musician. Next time I ran into John, I think, was when he started Harris Institute, which is a few years ago. And then I was also on the board of Metronome. So we've run into each other quite a bit. And in the business that I'm in, with its ups and downs and everything else, I have a few people that I know that if I need a lift or some information or solving problems, I can count them on my fingers, the number of people that I'll call. And one of those is John. So one of those is go-to. So I'll call him up, and we'll talk for a while and solve most of the world's problems, or none of them, but at least we talk about them, and it's generally positive. So very cool to have a few people like that in your life that you can call up or send a text or however you do it. So I'm going to turn it over to John here. I just have to click. Well, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, it's back to me, and clickety, clickety, click. John should appear magically from downtown Toronto. If you've never been to Harris Institute, it's worth a visit. It's an incredible building, and the whole facility is amazing. So John, if you want to fill in any of the cracks on your background there, you mentioned a few things, but obviously you know a lot more of it. I just need your mic on.
Yeah. Hi, Jim.
There you are.
Yeah, I lucked out. I got to be very active in various areas of the music industry during a time period that was quite magical. Looking back, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. And mostly I was involved in artist management with, I think the band that you referenced was the Magic Circus, which was the first group that I represented. And then that led to Ocean, which Put Your Hand in the Hand, and Lisa Hart, and Tranquility Base with Ian Thomas. 25 years of being involved with remarkable people doing remarkable things. It was fantastic. Most of those people I'm still good friends with, and it was a magical time period. And it led to all kinds of other activities related to music, but outside of the sphere of artist management. So I was involved with Bob Hahn from Montreal in taking the first Canadian written musical to Broadway, Rockabye Hamlet, which became the biggest flop ever in the history of Broadway at that time. However, the deal we made with Lester Osterman, who was the New York producer, we broke even. So we had this fantastic adventure with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton at the opening, etc. I was able to become the audio consultant for Pope John Paul's visit to Downsview Air Force Base, where we built the world's largest sound system, 18 delay towers, designed for 1.2 million people. Fantastic event. Was able to do concert promotion and started a record label, Rising Records, and music publishing. It was an adventure that was very satisfying, fulfilling, and I managed to do pretty well for 25 years. However, during that entire time period, I watched as almost everybody else had relatively short careers, 10 years, 15 years, where they had the opportunity to make a living doing something they loved, and then it ended prematurely and they had to get a real job to pay the rent. And that was a lot like watching people in withdrawal. And that led me in 1989 to decide to do something about it. I had been fortunate to be involved in various areas of the industry, and I knew I could teach if I put together the right team. A lot of people the information, skills, knowledge, and give them the confidence to have a lifelong career in music. So I started Harris Institute with a remarkable group of faculty, award-winning leaders who agreed to participate. And here it is, 35 years later, and it worked. Our graduates are now not only having a lifelong career in music, but they're winning so many awards I can't count them, and they're the big ones: the Grammys, Emmys, Oscars, Junos, SOCAN Awards, etc. So my personal experience has led me to be an educator. So I'm obviously not in the music industry per se anymore, but I get to be surrounded by keen, eager, energized people who are starting out a journey in the music industry, which is extremely fulfilling and satisfying.
Excellent. Great. So just looking ahead at, and obviously it's hard to predict much nowadays, but looking ahead at this year, any thoughts on where the music industry part of it will be going this year, in your opinion, for the next 12 months?
Okay, so interestingly, in 1992, I don't know whether you'll recall, I wrote a science fiction story for one of your publications, Professional Sound, about the future of the music industry and in particular recording. And in that story, I talked about a recording studio, remote recording studio in Barrie, in a person's living room that didn't have any equipment. It had a access terminal, and it was basically about cloud computing. And this was before the internet. And when that story came out, a lot of people in the industry said, no, nothing like that could happen. Well, everything has happened in that story. I go back and I use it now as a teaching tool to show how fast things changed. And the essence of that story was based on the fact that in the early 90s, the cost of recording had become the major impediment. A typical album was costing $250,000 to $300,000. Some albums were costing over $1 million. And that was creating an impediment at the entry level. So the entire story was about how to solve that problem, which happened. And we now have a completely different paradigm. So looking at the future today, I want to start with the elephant in the room, which is technology. It's affecting everything in a very big way, including the music industry. And we all know that the internet devastated the global music industry. It reduced its size by over 50%. Mid-level careers were disrupted left, right, and center. It was devastating. And But what a lot of people don't realize is things have turned upside down for the benefit of countries, especially Canada, in a monumental way. So here's what's happened recently. In 2012, the shrinkage of the industry stopped and it began to grow again. And then something totally unexpected and quite dramatic happened in 2015 when 7 out of the top 10 Billboard Hot 100 hits were by Canadian artists, primarily from in and around Toronto. Nothing remotely close to that had ever happened before. It was Drake, The Weeknd, Shawn Mendes, Alicia Cara, Justin Bieber, etc. Unprecedented. You have to go back to the early 70s to find a time when more than one Canadian artist was in the Billboard top 10. I think in 73, Joni Mitchell and Neil Young were, and Canadians were very excited. Well, 7 out of the top 10. So what's going on here? Because that has continued to this day. Well, this is what's going on. Yes, the internet decimated the global music industry, but it put everyone in the game, including Canada. And Canada was ready with the content. So we have been the biggest beneficiary. And it's quite dramatic. Drake and The Weeknd and others are still at the very, very top of the industry, with people like Taylor Swift, etc. But it's much deeper than that. It used to be everybody left Canada because we really didn't have much of a music industry here. Everybody left, dating back to the Four Lads and the Crew Cuts and the Diamonds and Hank Snow, leading to Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, David Clayton Thomas, all leaving, Denny Doherty leaving and joining the Mamas and Papas, Zal Yanofsky, to join another American act that went on to have huge success. That was typical. Today, nobody's leaving, or almost nobody's leaving. Drake lives in a great big house in North Toronto. Shawn Mendes lives in a condo on Toronto's waterfront. The Biebs has a big house near Stratford. Deadmau5 is in north of Toronto. Canadian artists aren't leaving anymore. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we now, for the first time really ever, have a healthy and growing Canadian music industry. The music industry I was in struggled, needed subsidies, needed help, barely existed really when you look back at it, compared to today, where there are hundreds and hundreds of Canadian-owned companies that are becoming successful. And I know this because in the last 10 years, I'm now getting calls from Canadian-owned companies related to the music industry offering jobs for real money. That didn't happen before. That's relatively recent. So for the first time ever, we have a healthy and growing Canadian music industry. And that's looking very strong. During COVID, obviously, it devastated a lot of industries, and it was responsible for closing a lot of smaller clubs, etc. But I don't know of any music-related companies that failed to get through that disaster. It's healthy and it's growing, and that is new. That didn't exist before. It was a major struggle. Now, Canada is not only on the map artistically with artists, but as an industry, it's a major player. That wasn't the case before. Some examples include Olay, that was started by Robert Ott, who was a former student of mine, which is now, they became so successful, they valued it over $1 billion, $1.5 billion. They bought Anthem, which is Russia's empire, and they are now the world's largest independent music publisher, and they're based in Toronto with branch plant offices in New York, Los Angeles, Nashville, and London. That's a complete flipping upside down of what the old paradigm was, where we in Canada had the branch plant office and the head office was elsewhere. That's just an indicator of how dramatic the change has been. And that's continuing. So, yes, the internet devastated the industry, but it is the reason that Canada is now a global player and winning big time. The other technological aspect that plays into this is audio recording technology. Literally, the cost of high quality recording is now 10 cents on the dollar of what it was. People now have access to tools to create high quality records and then have access to a free global distribution system. This is science fiction big time. The opportunities now that were impossible in the old paradigm are everywhere. And you combine high quality, low cost recording with the ability to distribute free globally, and the future for the Canadian music industry especially is very, very strong.
And you obviously notice that in your programs where you're teaching recording, business part and the recording, but even if you go back when Harris started and the technology of recording now that you're teaching, that's just mind-blowing.
It's almost 100% different.
5 years.
I look at our original curriculum, almost nothing has survived. It's all new. In fact, when Harris Institute started, that was the beginning of digital recording, and the big issue was analog versus digital. Well, digital won, and it's fantastic. It's put everybody in the game, and that is a wonder to witness and watch the impact of that.
Yeah, just even your school, when you started it, the kind of studio that you had to put in to be able to teach what was state of the art at that time. If you look at that now, that's changed drastically.
Well, as I said, it's about 10 cents on the dollar. Wow. The first studio we built at the original school, we relocated 5 years after the school started, but the first studio we built, to equip it, was minimum $1 million. Not to be necessarily state of the art, but just to be pro quality. When we relocated to 118 Sherbourne, we built 3 studios for maybe $200,000, and if we were doing that today, it would be even less. So the dynamic is spectacular in terms of opportunities for people to get into the field of audio. Back in the early days of Harris Institute, there was really only one choice for our audio graduates, and that was to go work at a great big studio and be an employee. Today, we've got hundreds of graduates who are doing their own thing because they can. And that is brand new and very dramatic.
Excellent. So looking ahead for the rest of this year, if you're a musician or an industry person, what are the big challenges in your mind? What are the big roadblocks that have to be overcome?
Well, the other major element in looking at the future of music in Canada is the regulatory legislative environment. And out of necessity, Canada needed to implement various programs to support the industry, dating back to Canadian content regulations in 1971. That only happened because the situation was dire. At that time, about 2% of what Canadian radio was playing was Canadian. And so there was no way to introduce or popularize Canadian artists. So starting with Canadian content regulations in 1971, leading to things like Factor, initially known as Foundation to Assist Canadian Talent on Records. The name has now been updated, but that subsidy to make Canadian records has assisted pretty well every Canadian artist that we know the name of. It helped them get off the ground by partially funding their recordings. And then if you add to that things like Ontario Creates or Canada Council, Ontario Arts Council, the Canadian Music Fund, and others, the regulatory legislative environment in Canada is better than any other country in the world. In a very real sense, this is the place to be. Countries come from all over the world to study these programs because they've worked big time, especially Factor. It has had an enormous impact on the development of new Canadian artists. So one recommendation for musicians that are in the early stages of their career is to become familiar with all of these elements that are already in place to support new and emerging artists. The other thing is, the new paradigm, the new music industry is vastly more complex than the industry I was in. The industry I was in, everybody specialized, where everybody knew a lot about something and often nothing about anything else. And that was the norm. That was typical. Today, because of the convergence of everything, somebody needs to know something about everything and a lot about something. And the best way, and some would say the only way, to know something about everything is to get some training education. There are many schools in this area. They all have strengths and weaknesses. One should do thorough research and find an educational program that is suited to your needs, because it's very complicated and you do need to know something about everything. At Harris Institute, we now have very, very broad-based programs touching on everything, because the era of specialization is over. Today, you need to know something about everything. And one of the interesting phenomena that has happened in recent times, because of global electronic distribution of music, is the fact that it used to be there were approximately 10,000 new releases a year, 5,000 singles, 5,000 albums. Last year, there were over 40 million new releases just on Spotify. So if you add in the other streaming companies, the clutter is unbelievable and nobody can find anything. And therefore, the new center of the universe of the music industry is everything to do with marketing. The old center was the distribution network controlled by major multinational record companies. If you weren't connected to a major multinational record company, you weren't in the game. Well, that's receding, going away. Today, everybody's in the game, but nobody can find anything. So marketing has become the new center, especially creative digital marketing. The traditional methods of marketing are all going by the wayside. It used to be that you'd buy print ads in trade papers and newspapers and magazines, and you'd advertise on radio, etc. Well, now that is all receding, disappearing in a lot of cases. I think this year many more traditional media are going to end, and it's all being replaced by a complex network of electronic digital media channels, from Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and on and on and on. There's a lot of them. And being able to creatively use those tools is where the new opportunities are in the music industry. Anybody that's good at that is assured a very excellent future, because that is the key. And in fact, that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, because there is so much new music available, there's always a percentage of people that are interested in new music, and there always has been. And today, those people are coming across a lot of new music, but a lot of it's not very good, because there's no coalition of quality available, like Rotten Tomatoes for the film industry. That's what's needed, is some kind of system in place where people can find high quality in all the different genres. Because the problem is, if people who are interested in finding things that are new continually find things that are new but not very good, pretty soon they're not interested in searching for things that are new. And that is the lifeblood of the entire industry, are people who are interested in finding things that are new. So that is a problem that I think is going to be resolved in short order, because I think a lot of people realize that that has got to change. And a system like Rotten Tomatoes is not that difficult to create, and I think within the next year that reality is going to happen. And then other issues that are potentially problematic. We're currently dealing up to today with what's happening in the United States, and Trump threatening tariffs, etc., which he now says he's going to introduce a week from now. One of the aspects of that issue, and Trump has already mentioned this, he's already announced reciprocal tariffs on countries all over the world. But he's also added to that there are mechanisms in place in various countries that he views as equivalent to unfair trade. And in Canada, our cultural industries have been a major priority of the United States ever since free trade was introduced in 1989. Successive trade representatives, from Mickey Cantor to Charlene Barchefsky, etc., their number one priority has been to get Canadian cultural industries into the free trade agreement, which now there's an exemption. And so what's going on right now could get quite dramatic, because if the United States attempts to punish Canada for those subsidies and support systems that are in place, that could have a devastating impact. The reality is, virtually no Canadian cultural industry could survive without those supports. It's a matter of population differences with the United States. So that is a pending issue that everybody should keep their eye on. My view is we have successfully fought to keep Canadian culture outside of free trade ever since it was reduced, through all the renegotiations, dealing right up to when our Prime Minister Trudeau and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland went to Washington in the latter stages of the new revised NAFTA to discuss that very issue, and won. So up till now, that has been protected, and theoretically that will continue, but it's an issue that people should be paying attention to.
I recall, I don't remember what year it was, but years ago there was a movement in the States to make it difficult or impossible for Canadian artists to go to the States and play. And it got resolved. But I wonder if you've heard anything about that this time around, if Mr. Trump's going to stop Canadian artists from working in the States.
Okay, so that's an interesting issue, because in Canada, in Toronto in particular, on Yorkville Avenue, we had quite a spectacular time period of Canadian musical expression. And at that time, artists like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Gordon Lightfoot, etc., could go to the border and enter the United States, and they were considered in a category that was not deemed to need a work permit. They just simply relocated because they were artists. It was a separate category. In the late 60s, the United States changed that. And that was devastating, because all of a sudden you needed a work visa in the United States. And the work visa was based on manpower criteria, where if an American could do the job, then you couldn't get a visa. So the ability to relocate to the United States basically got stopped, and it created a bottleneck in Yorkville. And one of the interesting things looking back now is that bottleneck created a time period where Canadian musicians evolved exponentially. And my view is most of the best music in the world was happening in Yorkville and thereabouts in the world, and nobody knows it, because most of those musical acts died on the vine, from Drastic Measures and Parachute Club, all of them. They couldn't do what artists had previously done. Now, ever since then, that has been a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge. Canadian artists today have to go through a horrendous series of roadblocks to get permission to tour in the United States, and they have to leave a withholding tax. It's not good now. I haven't heard anything or anybody suggest that that's going to get worse, but it's already a challenge. The good part is there are many Canadian artists that are achieving significant success without having to leave the country, and that's new. So yeah, I would be surprised if that scenario gets worse.
Wow. So as far as opportunities, what do you see is if you're a young person, if you were starting again, let's say, in today's world, what do you see the big opportunities for Canadian musicians and industry people in the next year?
Well, okay, when you look at the issues related to being a musical artist today, there's one issue that is gigantic, and that is the global music industry has broken records for growth over the last 4, 5, 6 years. It's spectacular, the earnings from streaming. The issue is the money is not filtering down to the creative community, which has made it extremely challenging for new emerging artists to eke out a living. Now, fortunately, everybody knows that's the problem. And awareness, especially broad-based awareness, leads to the beginnings of progress. And that's what's happening right now in real time in the United States, in the EU, in the UK, and in Canada. The legislators are looking at this and beginning to take actions. So I believe that in a relatively short period of time, this issue is going to be not necessarily completely resolved, but made a whole lot better. If you compare it to the industry I was in, where the typical record deal, it was almost impossible to actually make a royalty when you pick apart how the math worked. Most artists that had very successful records, gold records, whatever, never actually made a royalty because of the recoupment scenario, et cetera, et cetera. That is true to this day. And the issue is, back then, nobody knew that was happening. Artists discovered there's a problem here after they had a gold record and wanted to know why they didn't get a royalty. And then somebody explained how a record deal worked. That's still true today, all because there wasn't broad-based awareness. And that's what's changed. Because of mass media and electronic media, virtually everybody knows this is the current problem. And that is leading to actions to resolve it in real time. That's new. That didn't used to happen. If you go back in history, it took hundreds of years often for there to be broad-based awareness of a problem, at which point they began to fix it. Then it took decades. Now it takes seconds. We hear of problems from all over the world related to everything, almost in real time as they're happening. That's new. And that, I think, is going to lead to enormous progress on multiple fronts in a relatively short period of time because of broad-based awareness that there's a problem. And that's when people begin to address it. Interestingly, in related to music, way back in the latter part of the last century, the Hudson River in New York City became the first focus of environmental issues when the Hudson River became grossly polluted. So Pete Seeger, the musician, went on a North American awareness campaign to bring awareness to the issue of pollution. That awareness campaign was the first major awareness that there's a problem, and it led in relatively short order to two major U.S. laws that address the problem. And today, there are whales swimming in the Hudson River. It got fixed. Similarly, with the hole in the ozone, that became a globally recognized major problem. And for the first time ever in Montreal, 176 countries met to sign a document to fix the problem. That happened in relatively short order, all because there was broad-based awareness. So what's happening in the music industry right now is everybody knows that streaming's making a lot of money, but the musical community is not benefiting, and that has to be fixed. And I think it's going to be largely changed in a positive way in a relatively short period of time.
You and I have talked about Harris graduates, and a lot of them, rather than following the traditional route of getting a job at wherever, recording studio, record company, have chosen to start their own business. And you've risen to that occasion, I guess, and you give training in that area. I wonder if you could just talk about that, what the opportunities that are there for somebody in the industry to not work for somebody else, to start their own company. How do they start? And obviously, if you look at your list of people that have been at Harris and started companies, there's a pretty big success record there.
Well, way back at the beginning in 1989, it was evident and obvious to me that the music industry was about to go through a metamorphosis from being controlled by very large companies, major multinational record companies, and big studios with 30 to 50 staff, that it was about to change to an industry that was dominated by many, many, many more smaller companies. So from day one at Harris Institute, we have had an emphasis on all things entrepreneurial. How to start a company, how to raise money, how to put a business plan together, how to market a new company, and on and on and on. Both programs have a major emphasis on entrepreneurialism. And now, 35 years later, it worked. We've got, I'm guesstimating 30 to 35% of our graduates have started companies that have, in many cases, gone on to become the most successful companies in their sector, from concert promotion companies to record labels to studios, et cetera, et cetera. Back in the early days of Harris Institute, those opportunities weren't there. Today, they're there in spades. And I actually tell my students, if I wasn't involved with the school, I'd get back in the music business today, because it's exciting and there are opportunities that were impossible in the old paradigm. And many of our graduates are taking advantage of that. Because the Ontario government recently passed regulations to eliminate us getting any student visas, which is overkill and a disaster. Private colleges like Harris Institute are now eligible for 0 student visas, and we have had 30 to 40% international students from the very beginning. Now we have almost none. Because of that, for the first time in the school's history, I had to do some marketing of what we've achieved. And one of the things that I did that amazed me was I put together a listing of graduates who have started successful companies. And as I was doing it, it just went on and on and on and on, from Arts and Crafts, which is Canada's leading independent record label, to Admiral Entertainment, which is Central Ontario's most successful concert promoter, to booking agencies, to Union Sound, which is now regarded as Toronto's 3rd top recording studio. Went on and on and on. So we continue to have an emphasis in that area. And the sad thing is that most, if not all, schools involved in any area of the arts have little or no emphasis on how you would do it yourself, on entrepreneurism. And the biggest reason for that is that in most educational environments, it's academics who have no business background, have never been in the business, don't know anything about it, don't have any interest, and don't want to know about it. So they're very good on the aesthetics in that particular discipline, but often there is 0 emphasis on anything to do with how you would do it on your own. And that continues to be one of our strengths.
Excellent. I think one thing that's important too, looking at our audience or the number of musicians that are out there, is training, I guess, or convincing musicians that they need to treat their career as a business.
Mm-hmm.
So, same as starting any other business, if you want your band or your solo career or your songwriting career to be successful, it should be treated as a business. And for a lot of musicians, it's treated more as a hobby, I think, and expect business results from a hobby.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that happened recently in the last U.S. federal election with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, Harris had a press conference where she outlined her economic aspects of her platform, and she had three components, and one was to exempt taxes from tips, which that didn't go over very well because everybody knew that Donald Trump had already brought that up. And then she had, as the second aspect, was a $25,000 grant for first-time house buyers, which did make some sense and could make a difference. But the third element was that she got a lot of blowback for, was a grant of $50,000 for people to start a new company. And I listened to that and thought, oh my God, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because you can't just give somebody money and expect they'll be able to start a successful company. There's more to it than that. Had she instead announced that she was going to create specific training to do with how to start a company across the United States, that might have made some sense. And the day after she made that announcement, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine, and I mentioned this, that I thought this was a really stupid idea. And the person said, why? And I said, well, because I have spent 35 years teaching people how to do it, and that's working. And it absolutely would not work if you don't know what you're doing. And so for a musician who obviously has a passion and an interest in music, the likelihood is today that at some point, maybe not off the top, but at some point, you're going to be doing your own thing, which means you're going to be starting a company, which means you need to learn how to do it. You can't just wing it and hope that it's going to work out. No, you need to know how to do it. And it's not easy, and it requires education and training. And so that would be my message to musicians. I mean, most of our students are musicians, but they're looking at a way to make a living involved with music, which often isn't being a musician. It's being a producer or an engineer or a manager or an agent or a publicist or whatever. And eventually doing their own thing. So my recommendation to anyone who has a strong interest, passion for music, is to get specific training to enable you to start something and build something over a period of time in your career.
For sure. There's one of the questions that came up here is on radio airplay. I wonder if you could address that a little bit. Just they're asking you, how do you get radio airplay? That's a pretty broad subject, but in your opinion, where's radio at now? I hear various things, that it's very strong or that it's doing terrible. And I still feel that it's important to get your songs on the radio if the music makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So all traditional media, from television, radio, print, newspapers, magazines, etc., is confronting a dilemma that unfortunately is pervasive, and that is the advertising community is fleeing traditional media, devastating the entire sector. I mean, last year in Ontario, the Toronto Star, which is Canada's most successful newspaper, it closed down its entire division, Metroland, which I think was 120 or 125 regional newspapers, just closed it down. This is all because of decreasing ad revenue. And unfortunately, that's not coming back. Advertisers on various platforms, whether it be Google ads or Facebook ads or any of the other online platforms, can target an audience, it's way less expensive. I mean, it's got so many advantages over traditional media that unfortunately in 2025, this year, I think that we're going to see the collapse of quite a bit of the mainstream media landscape, from television, radio, print, magazines, newspapers, etc. For radio in particular, it needs to reinvent itself. It's still a significant player, and but nowhere near what it used to be. I mean, it used to be the primary means of popularizing new artists and new music. Today, it's playing a much less significant role, and that's going to continue. And radio, but I think radio will survive and exist in new formats over time, whereas some other media, like print media, where you've got the very expensive proposition of actually printing publications, is going to disappear. So in cars now, you've got Sirius XM, whereas people used to listen to the radio. It is confronted by a lot of issues that aren't easy to solve, and it's never coming back to play the role that it once played.
What about playing live, the importance of that? And obviously the pandemic killed it for a while, but it's come back, and live music seems to be very powerful right now. What are your thoughts on that for an artist?
Well, last year, records were broken in terms of gross revenues for live performance globally. It has bounced back. However, that's mostly at the top end. Things like Taylor Swift's Eras tour was like unbelievably successful. Whereas at the bottom end and the mid-range, it is continuing to struggle. For example, in Canada, in Toronto in particular, we lost quite a few smaller venues that were home to a lot of emerging artists. Now, we have seen an uptick in excellent quality new venues in Toronto, from the new Hughes Room to the Redwood Theatre to History, etc. Mostly mid-range, mid-sized venues seem to be on the comeback trail. Now, the role of live performance, which has always been a significant part of the equation, is arguably more important than ever today. And that is because of the clutter. New artists creating an impact live can get things started. So an artist that is able to perform live, connect with an audience, and create a buzz, per se, has a huge leg up in this new system of clutter, where there's just so much out there that gets missed. I mean, arguably, there's more better music available today than ever before, but nobody can find it. That's the problem. Live performance, I think, is more important than ever.
What about the time of year? It's almost March. What about the summer festivals? Are there opportunities there for up and coming artists?
Yeah, festivals seem to have survived. In fact, yesterday or the day before, there was an announcement that the Fry Festival is going to try a second time. That was the most convoluted crash of a festival probably in history, and now the guy that started it, that went to jail, is going to try to do it again. And the tickets are up to 1.1 million each, so I'm not sure that's gonna fly. But yeah, festivals and conferences, in Canada, North by Northeast has not only survived, but it seems quite healthy. Canadian Music Week, although it went through an ownership change last year, looks like it's going to come out as a major player. And these are viable, workable mechanisms to introduce new talent to others who can help advance that artist. So yeah, those are continue to be a big part of the equation.
I think, the up and coming artist in some cases just has to do the work, has to do the prospecting, figure out where the opportunities are. And a lot of times they're not going to have a booking agent, so they've just got to get out and hustle.
Well, that's where today you need to know something about everything comes in. Often you're doing everything. In the old paradigm, the emphasis was almost totally on how to get a record deal. Because once you get a record deal, the record company took over marketing and distribution, et cetera, tour support and videos, et cetera. Well, today, that is no longer available in most cases. So if it's going to get done, you have to do it, which means you need to know something about it. And if you don't, it doesn't get done, and you probably don't launch your career.
For sure. So I'm going to wrap it up here soon. A lot of questions here.
Well, before you wrap it up, I just want to mention one other thing that I think
no problem.
comes into the future of music in Canada, and that's the artistic aspect. The saying is the world needs more Canada, and I agree with that. But more specifically, the world needs more Canadian art, especially music. If you look at recent history, Canadian artists that have impacted the globe, going back to Oscar Peterson, going back to Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, the list is very long of Canadian musical artists that were doing something that was very artistic on the pendulum of entertainment and art, and delivering valuable messages that are good for the future of civilization. We in Canada have nurtured and developed exceptional musical artists for decades, and that is continuing. You look at what happens in other countries, for example, K-pop, or a lot of what happens in the United States, the formulaic things like corporate rock or disco or whatever. Well, if you look at Canada, the essence of what Canadian artists have delivered to the world is quite special and quite valuable. And that gives us not just an advantage, I think, but also the responsibility to take more great Canadian art, music, to the world.
For sure. And I think that's an important point, that to just focus on the business or the money,
right?
It just doesn't work. In any business, you have to have a passion for what you're doing, no matter what it is. And I think that's important. It's easy to get lost in the business and a lot of other things, and lose focus on your art and the excitement of the music, and then figuring out how to get that out there. But I think sometimes a lot of musicians just get so discouraged and focused on the wrong things. And in Canada, we've got such a variety of styles when you look at it over the years. Some of that's got to do with our varied culture and our geography. If you look at, artists from BC, Quebec especially has a crazy number of amazing artists, population, and the East Coast again, and they're all really different. And they're, when you meet these people, and John and I meet them all the time, they're just fanatical about what they do, and you have to be.
Yeah, if you use as a criteria which artists on the planet have delivered real value and meaning through music, Canada comes out number one. And that has always been the case, and it continues to be the case. And that is one of our major threats, or not threats, advantages going into the future is the nature of Canadian music and its meaning and value have cut through for decades and continue to be part of the equation.
And that, yeah, and obviously it's up to you, the attendee here today, to take advantage of that. So I want to wind it up here in a minute. I just want to thank John for his time today, and I'll encourage all of you to go to institute.com and check. John does tours, so you can make your way down there and have a look, see what it's all about, meet the teachers. They're all very accessible. I think that's the other thing too. A lot of times people get the impression that they have no help, that they're all by themselves, and it just isn't true. There's so many people in the industry that are helpful, and I know for sure in our experience, we've hired higher students a lot of times to do events and that, and we know most of the teachers there. So it's a good resource as well, whether you decide to go to school there or not. So, sign up, get on the tour. John's easy to find, so am I. So if you've got questions you didn't get answered here, fire off an email or go to